time is now 10 o'clock here in Luxembourg, where I am calling in from. So I think it's due time that we slowly but securely start kicking this off. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to jump into it. So
Awesome.
it's so nice to see so many people having shown interest in this, and it's really incredible actually. So I think we're all excited from Einar and Partners today. But with that being said, we have a lot to cover today, guys, don't we? So maybe, let's jump into it. So first of all, a very welcome to all of you who are taking the time to join our CSDM Masterclass. As I mentioned, it's now 10 o'clock here in the morning in Luxembourg, where I'm calling from, and then for my colleagues over in Amsterdam, then the time is the same. So let's dive in. First of all, as I said, warm welcome. It really means a lot to us with having all of you being so invested in showing up to these masterclasses and engaging with our content. For those of you who are joining today and maybe don't know who Einar and Partners are or haven't heard about us before, I just want to take a few minutes to speak about who we are. So it's an easy sales pitch. Einar and Partners, we do one thing and one thing really well. That's strategy in ITOM and AIOps. And for us, CSDM very much falls under the scope of IT operations and beyond. We work with ServiceNow as our primary platform. And as indicated by the name, we have a very partner-focused strategy. So it's nice to see some of our friends out there from other partners who are joining. But in general, we are all very passionate about data models, service operations, CMDB, CSDM, and everything that comes with it. And I'd like to say that we've now started to gather quite some experience in this area. So I'm super happy today to be able to sit here together with my colleagues and with all here in the audience to share some of these experiences, but perhaps more importantly, share some of the research we've done here the past year. Now, just some housekeeping. For the session today, you should be able to have a Q&A box. So at any time, you can always ask questions. The session will also be recorded and distributed. So it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if there is areas here which maybe you don't feel that you're up to speed with, you can always go back and have a look at them again. With that being said, then what are we going to cover here today? Well, as mentioned, we've done quite some research over the past year, which my colleague Akif will tell more about soon. But first of all, we're going to look at what are the scoping trends for CSDM, where is the industry really heading, and how is the landscape developing. We're also going to look into some use cases and values around CSDM. And this is not the high-level sort of things that you find in product descriptions and so forth, but this is actual realized use cases of organizations out there and the value they perceive from CSDM. Not only based on the research, but also based on our own experiences having implemented and advised on CSDM a lot. We're also going to share some best practices and governance tips, especially me and Fabian. And based on this, you will also learn about some lessons learned from both our research, but also from our own experiences. So we only have 1 hour to cover a lot of material. But with that being said, maybe we can first introduce ourselves. So starting with myself, me who's speaking right now, my name is Alexander Ljungström. I am the managing director at Einar and Partners. And I always like to call myself a very avid enthusiast and very passionate when it comes to IT operations and CSDM. Not just from a technical perspective, but what really drives me is more actually the governance and people aspect behind it. Because for me, CSDM is essentially a testament to organizational psychology more than anything else. So I'm very excited to be able to pitch in some of my direct experiences and knowledge today, but I'm not alone. So I have my dear friends with me. So Fabian, maybe you can go ahead and introduce yourself. who are you? And by the way, it's super nice to be doing another masterclass with you.
Thank you. Likewise. So my name is Fabian Kunska. I've been doing ITOM projects for almost 10 years now. For me, first time I went in touch, let's say, with CSDM, it was really amazing to see the structure that it brings into a very chaotic topic sometimes, and getting the kind of transparency that's needed and connecting the dots behind it. And since then, I've been very excited and passionate about bringing CSDM into operations teams and organizations from a more bottom-up approach, which is super interesting to see because it kind of moves into the strategy from a whole different direction. Instead of going from management level downwards, you're going from, hey, this happens in the real world, and we're trying to apply that so that also management gets transparency about it. And this is where I'm super eager to share some insights on my end from my experience with CSDM projects from the past, to see how that aligns with the general approach towards CSDM.
Love it. Love it. Super cool that you're here, Fabian. And then we also have Akif. So Akif, why don't you tell a few words about yourself, the brain behind our research?
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everyone. My name is Akif. I'm the R&D lead of the research unit, driving this CSDM research and benchmarking survey for the past 9 months. And my primary role here at the research unit is to really know the unknown within ITOM, AIOps, and CMDB CSDM. We investigate the ITOM market and try to really get in the benchmark industry-leading best practices, gather really data around key metrics and KPIs related to how to make an ultimate CSDM project. So we can provide insights to our consultants, partners, and customers, the key insights so they can do a great ITOM project. That's very briefly about me and what we do at the research unit, Alex.
Thank you, Akif. Yes, very excited to unveil the results here today together with you. So I think most of the people who have joined, they are here to really get straight into it. So let's do that. And I want to start off here with just setting the stage a little bit. So what we see when we go out to organizations is that obviously right now CSDM is a huge topic on a lot of roadmaps out there. It's hard to miss, and virtually the entire ServiceNow platform is very much dependent on CSDM. But at the same time, what we see are a couple of characteristics. So first of all, we notice that many clients, they have a CMDB, but there's a plateau which has been reached. So the CMDBs tend to be heavily infrastructure oriented, not very service oriented. In general, it tends to be too much data with too little context. What is things actually used for? And then when it comes to starting to scope CSDM, then we find that a lot of organizations find it overwhelming of where to start and in which end to really approach it from. Also use cases and explaining value, that most of the people probably joining the call here today, may you be an architect or maybe a platform owner or something like that. You probably can identify with the use cases. But we often see that explaining the value beyond IT is a challenge, and that things tends to become too focused a little bit on the data model, but when it comes to how it's actually used and making the use cases tangible, that's where organizations are struggling. And then finally, on the governance and people aspect, one of the main reasons to do CSDM is around ownership and responsibility. So what does it mean to own certain data, essentially? And this is another thing which we will be speaking about today. And also that organizations, they want to strive for more and more simple governance. Things needs to be user-friendly, not boring big documents. But all of these factors combined is, often the starting point where organizations starts looking into CSDM or when they're going to expand it. And that is exactly what we have benchmarked and measured, right, Akif? So maybe you can tell a little bit, what have we actually been doing the past year in the research unit?
Indeed, to show a little bit the process behind the insights we will present today. For the past 9 months, we surveyed 35 global enterprises worldwide. And then with worldwide, I mean really like from different regions around the world. So we captured kind of that global perspective on CSDM implementations around the world, and measured 25 plus data points to key factors and metrics related to the objects and CSDM objects and scoping, value and use cases, and sentiment. We really benchmarked that and tried to find patterns and insights, and then we made sense together with our ITOM thought leaders at Einar Partners. We made sense of these key metrics and KPIs, provide you a benchmarked industry-leading best practices. There's a lot of great insights, and we will present that in this webinar. But all in all, it was an exciting journey, and I'm very happy that we are here to present you these findings.
Definitely. Yes, same. So it's been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that has gone into this. So let's start approaching a bit of the content then. And by the way, I forgot to say before, we will have like a Q&A session in the end, but at any point in time, just feel free to pitch in questions in the Q&A box. So, okay, let's then go through this data a little bit. And then after that, we will look at some best practices, some tips and lessons learned. And we actually want to start off with the CSDM scoping and roadmap trends. So where is the market really heading to? And today, when I'm going to speak about CSDM, I will make a bold assumption, which is that you guys who are here in the masterclass today, you are already somewhat familiarized with the data model. So in front of you, you see the data model CSDM 4.0. It has been made a little bit more user-friendly by us at Einar and Partners, but you can probably recognize some of these objects like business applications, business services, etc. Today, I will not go through the definitions of what all of these means. So if someone is here today in this masterclass wondering what is one of these objects when we're referring to them, then put a pin on it, and then you can always go to our YouTube channel. We have plenty of videos and material where we go through the more technical parts of the data model. So I just wanted to mention that, but the research is covering these objects that you see here in front of you. So starting then with the general industry trends, and then maybe explaining how we actually measure this. So first of all, what you're seeing here in front of you is the most common CSDM objects that we chose to measure in our research. And you see here 2 data points. One is where organizations used to be when we started, or just slightly before the research. And then where is the current maturity? So essentially you see where people used to be versus where they are today. And now, what can we make out of this data then? Well, if we interpret the data, then we see a couple of things really popping out. The first one is it's a huge push right now for application services. And what we see is that in the past, roughly half of organizations, they were busy with application services. But these days, it's almost reaching 90%. So it's a big investment going into application services right now. Also, interestingly enough, we see that technical services is also experiencing a very big jump. This has always been a bit blurry for organizations, in my opinion, like what is really a technical service? Have we really used that concept before? But now we see that the industry is really starting to take it seriously, and that almost 80% is actively working on technical services currently. Also, a very interesting insight here is that the business services, they remain fairly static. So slightly over 50%, they are working with business services, but very few, if any, organizations right now, at least during our research, they are not choosing to add it newly to their roadmap. And finally, for those of you who know a little bit more about CSDM, what I at least found quite interesting is that finally, the later stages of the model, meaning the business capabilities, we also see quite an unexpected increase into almost 40% being busy on working on it. So this is a general trend of how things are moving across all industries. We're not going to show it today, but we also have data like this for finance and manufacturing, where actually it's slightly different. But I thought this could be interesting to start off with at least. Now, if we put these objects then into the maturity stages of CSDM, so for those of you who have been working a little bit with it or been doing some reading about it, you might recognize the classic ServiceNow sort of crawl, walk, run, and fly state. And here we also observe a couple of interesting things. So almost 90% of organizations are now actively working or have at least fairly completed, well, I say completed within quotes, the crawl stage. Now, of course, there's always a continuous improvement of things, so you never really complete a certain area as such, but it's still interesting to see that virtually like almost all of organizations are really touching now upon the crawl stage of CSDM. The walk stage, so that aligns quite well to the technical services that we see a big jump right now in moving from roughly half of the correspondents, almost up to 80%, is now busy with the walk stage. And then just like mentioned, the run state, so more like business services and so forth, it sees less development. So that correlates quite well to the data we showed before. Interesting knack on this is that 40% or almost half of organizations in some capacity is approaching the latest or the last stage of the maturity model, which is the fly stage. So for me, this is quite interesting because it shows that the basic maturity to a large degree is starting to get reached across the landscape, and that people now really are expanding beyond that basic maturity. I'm going to speak about that soon a little bit as well.
Yeah, Alex, can I jump in there? Maybe?
Yeah, for sure.
Because we got an interesting question about not developing on the business services as much. And I think we're going to touch on that later as well. But I think what is important to highlight here is that within these surveys, we also looked at industries where we have internal teams that are part of a bigger organization. That are looking at themselves as the IT organization of a larger scale. And there it's kind of a natural behavior that we see a focus shifting more towards the technical service definitions instead of the business service definitions, because these IT teams or IT organizations within a bigger organization try to start off by identifying themselves first and defining their picture first. And that's usually shifting onto the technical side. So we are going to touch on that later in depth a bit more, but I think it's interesting to keep that in mind, that what we see a kind of non-increase in the business service side, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are not taking steps forward. It more or less just reflects the fact that a lot of the customers that we are looking at and a lot of the industries we are looking at internal IT organizations that don't see themselves as kind of a business service provider. Yeah. Which is an interesting thought aspect that we are going to look at later on, because it might not be the actual truth that CSDM reflects. So that's an interesting thought process, and we are going to look at that later on.
For sure.
That's where part of it comes from.
Yeah, thanks, Fabian. And just to add to that very briefly, and it was actually a friend or a colleague of mine, Mikko, at Qualdatrix, who wrote about it yesterday. I also think, and he's right, I also think that business services has historically been a bit misused. It has been the slush bucket. Everyone has put things into business services, and now we see that people are more starting to use the correct objects, and they start understanding the definitions more. So very nice. Now, the question is then, we also looked at which areas are people keep on reinvesting in. So let's say you start with business services or application services. What areas do people continue reinvesting in year after year to improve it, versus what areas are added completely new to the roadmap? So we're going to break down a couple of these objects here. And what we see is that application services, almost half of the organizations have continuous work with application services, and roughly a third is now adding them to their roadmap or expanding their roadmap with application services. Technical services, we see that roughly a third keeps on reinvesting in their technical services and build out that data quality. And then finally, that 1/3 there as well is adding technical services completely new to their roadmaps. And then if we look at business services, then, and I think this highlights a little bit the point we discussed, Fabian, that it, just because there isn't a huge expansion in it, then there is still a lot of companies who either historically have created it, may it be right or wrong, but it's there and they continue to reinvest in it. So roughly half of the correspondents, they are continuously improving their business services. But indeed, like mentioned, very few are actually adding it completely new to their roadmap. So maybe it's saturated, maybe it can be various factors here, and I think it depends a bit on the organization. And finally, looking at the business application, where a lot of CSDM projects tend to start, then same there, that more than half keeps on reinvesting in their business application portfolio and really improving that quality, and less than a third is now adding it to their roadmap completely. So why is this interesting then? Well, you've now seen some of the data broken down, and we have way more data than this, but let's apply some analysis on this data. So looking then at some of the key insights related to these roadmaps, what can we determine? Well, first of all, a basic maturity appears to have been widely reached. So most organizations, they are actively working or have achieved this crawl phase of CSDM. So that is application services and business applications. So if your organization haven't yet, then it can be a good time to catch up. But like said, reinvestment in application services and business applications is still very relevant. So it shows that a basic maturity has been reached, but not necessarily fully completed, because people keep on reinvesting in it. But interestingly enough, and I think here this is something that we also saw in our research, is this model from ServiceNow of crawl, walk, run, and fly is rarely followed. In some cases it are, and it often starts with the crawl phase. But then after that, we see actually that most organizations, they rather work with targeted areas of the CSDM model based on their needs, rather than the fully recommended pathway by ServiceNow, let's say. So we see that depending on the industry and depending on management priorities, etc., how things look after the crawl phase may be very individual based on the organization or company. I'm not sure, Fabian, is this something you've experienced too, I guess, working with CSDM a little bit, that it can be approached from various angles, right?
And this goes hand in hand back to the question of the business service definition side being underutilized, which we definitely see. It is always a question of where do I come from when addressing the CSDM side of thing. So we are working more. I'm working with a customer right now in an industry sector where they have a large scale scope with just some scope on enterprise architecture. So they are actually defining the CSDM model from the business capability standpoint and starting with that. Which means that they have a great definition in business applications, business capability, and they lack application service definitions. And we have other companies from the manufacturing industry, for example, that are moving from a purely operational side. So they are starting with application service definitions. They have CMDB groups, for example. And this usually doesn't strictly align to the crawl, walk, run, and fly phases.
Exactly.
But what we see more and more is that companies invest their time defining a service catalog, either on the technical service side or on the business service side. They very rarely do both at the same time, which again reflects in the research that we are doing, that where not a lot is invested into the business service side, because there's usually a focus on either of the two sides, which again doesn't clearly line up with the phases. And it really comes down to where the business focus lies right now. Where is the maturity needed? And what we see with DORA, what we see with operationalized focused environments, is that the focus is more or less on application service structure right now, and defining what kind of offerings I have from the inside out. So from the technical service side, it's less on the focus around what do I offer as a company and how do I offer that, which would be the business service and the business service offering side. And this is where we kind of have this disalignment, I would say, with the maturity phases, where it's just less of, hey, how complete is our overall CSDM model, and more use case specific. And this leads us to a point where some parts of the CSDM model are just criminally underutilized, where other parts are getting overvalued. And this is, I think, something very interesting that, especially from a consultancy perspective, we have to address in a certain way without pushing the topic too much. Because when you push it too much, you again risk that all the focus now shifts on the things that you're pushing, which can slow down the other parts as well. But in general, the way when we work with customers, what I noticed helps a lot is using the crawl, walk, run, and fly phases. Kind of a template, kind of a starting point, but then adapting that to the focus of the customer.
Yeah, basically, you should still have a stepped approach. It might not just follow 100% what ServiceNow suggests. And I think this can be a good key takeaway here as well, that if you are on a pathway where you approach it more targetedly, don't feel bad about it, but that it can sometimes be valid as well. Okay, so then also in the research, what we saw is that unexpectedly enough, a lot of people are busy with creating technical services or business services, but not everyone is busy with creating offerings. And this really stood out for us. So the data suggests that offerings tends to be neglected in some organizations and maybe fundamentally misunderstood sometimes. What really is an offering? Why is it necessary? And so forth. So we believe that sooner or later, this might, you're going to have to pay for it, and not in a good way. So I'm going to get back to that later a little bit, but I believe, in general, that what we see is people who don't utilize offerings, they end up basically recreating the functionality in other ways, which then is not out-of-the-box compliant. And I think you're going to touch upon some of these best practices later, Fabian, as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and then finally, some other insights related to the roadmap trends is organizations tends to blow up the scope. So, the primary feedback during our research was that people try to do too much too fast, and that it's better to work with a small part and do it well and really be disciplined on that scope. So this is around the scoping and where the industry is heading then a little bit. We also started measuring some of the use cases and why people essentially, choose to invest in CSDM and go on this journey. So I think here, Akif, you also had some interesting insights, but we see here in front of us two graphs. On the left side, it's basically what ServiceNow platform values did the project aim to enable or achieve, right? And how should we interpret that data on the left side?
Exactly. So why do people implement CSDM, and what do they get from a CSDM implementation? And one of the main patterns or observations we saw from our survey and the correspondences, they enabled new functionalities and features, and they go more out of the box and optimize costs. Like, these were the primary kind of the values they have realized and drivers of doing a CSDM project. And of course, we also asked what cultural benefits, for example, it brought to your organization. And we saw it's a majority of them, only few did not indicated that they haven't gained some cultural benefits, but 85% of the correspondents saw cultural benefit. And with cultural benefits, we mean like a improved sense of ownership and improving the service mindset and delivery, and improved governance. And especially like these points are very interesting, because when we also look into the use cases that we have benchmarked, It's actually in the next
Maybe we can
slide.
go there. So how did we then look at the use cases here? Because this is more like specific, and it should be mentioned here that these are realized use cases. So not just what people intended to do, but what they achieved to do. So here we see that correlates quite well to especially governance and control, right, Akif? On the right side here, we see that almost 50% achieved improved governance, for example, ownerships, accountability. So that ties in pretty well to what you said about the cultural benefits, correct?
Yeah, indeed. Also improves reporting to optimize costs. That CSDM has been used for that a lot too. And of course, ITSM process and end-to-end monitoring. But when we look at the governance transparency aspects, there we see a lot. The organizations have achieved a lot. Realize benefits and outcomes in that area a lot, and which is very interesting actually. But it might not be surprising, but again, we were able to really capture this, a little bit double check if that's really true, because this is what one of the things that CSDM brings as a value and benefits. And now we are able to also ask actually organizations and able to double check, kind of benchmark it and see that they really achieve it. And that's really nice to see.
No, absolutely. And of course, I saw we received here a question about, there might have been values which we didn't measure, which, we maybe should have measured and so forth. So this is a starting point, and we also intend to iterate upon, our monitoring and our benchmarking to add more of these sort of values. But what I think is interesting here, again, is that these are realized use cases. So it's not just we want to do this, but we achieved the followings. And what we see, especially around the transparency across services, governance, that for me, the primary key takeaway is that it is almost more of a cultural journey than a technical exercise. So very interesting indeed. Okay, so this is some of the data that we have been crunching, and we have already launched our first report where we deep dive a little bit more into this data, but we're also going to launch 2 more, which we'll speak about later on, where you can all sort of dig into this more in depth. But with that being said, I think one of the aspects then is, okay, knowing these things, having, we've literally sat down and held like in-depth interviews and multiple meetings and so forth with over 20 of these organizations. And it should be added here that this is not the client project from Einar and Partners, but this is like independent from the projects we're working on, because we want to have that neutral and independent data. What are some of the key best practices that we can distill from this then? What is the research telling us? So jacking into that governance topic and cultural values, one of the big key factors is how do we really govern CSDM? And there are different models here, but what we saw quite reoccurring, and also what we've experienced in our own projects, is how do we govern CSDM? And there are essentially here 2 common models. One is to have a quite centralized approach. So what that means is that the organization creates a CSDM team, and that CSDM team really is the tip of the spear, but they require the rest of the organization quite heavily for input. So often we see that those organizations, they create something like a central SACAM team or CSDM team or whatever you want to call them. But that team is the one who is responsible for creating the modelings, for actually mapping the services. So there is a lot of responsibility on that team, and the service owner involvement is more limited. It's more used for verifying results and verifying data. But it is the team that publishes, maintains, and retires the services. Then we have a more decentralized approach. You may still have a CSDM team in the background who dictates certain governance principles, But in the decentralized approach, what we see there is that there's a broader involvement from the wider organization. So you actually have service owners who themselves build services. They maintain the data, they care about the life cycles, and they also come with feedback and requirements, maybe to the CMDB or CSDM team. So these models, they stand in quite stark contrast to each other in the way that it impacts a company. And what we looked on these sort of models here is how does this then correlate to things like organizational involvement, the responsibility of service owners, timeline, costs, trainings, etc. So in a centralized model, what we see is that, again, the organizational involvement is to mainly have a strong core team in CSDM. The service owners are still involved, but mostly to validate services and come with input. The timeline tends to generate faster results because you don't really need to embed that entire service mindset in all the application teams, in all the service owners. And the costs, they are primarily on the ServiceNow team and or external consultants. But basically, it's very oriented towards training that core team, and they go out there chasing people in the organization. On the flip side, the decentralized model, it tends to require like a broader understanding of CSDM, not only in the ServiceNow team, but also in service owners. And they are then expected to also build their own services, either using Service Builder, catalog items, or something similar. And this tends to have longer timelines because, yeah, you rely much more heavily on service owners understanding the concepts. But you gain a lot of cultural benefit from it, of course. So there's more internal cost and effort that is allocated to the application and service teams, and it typically requires a more extensive support network. So why are we mentioning this? Well, because one of the things when you plan a CSDM journey, it doesn't matter how small or big, is to really understand where in these camps do you fall. So the main conclusion here on a centralized fashion is that it might be a suitable option if the internal time is constrained, or when you really just want fast data quality, but you don't really care how, if it's by service owners, if it's by your own team, etc. So it requires less organizational involvement. And then on the decentralized model, that's the more long-term approach, which enables that deeper sense of ownership for the service owners to really describe and model what's in their shop. And of course, sometimes we see that there exist hybrid versions here. But if you're involved in a CSDM project, then this can be really valuable to really think about intentionally of how do you design the governance around the CSDM project, basically. So, with that said, then looking at another use case, we speak a lot about ownerships in service owners and so forth. We'd like to share with you a blueprint for an ownership model. And this might not always be true, but it's just to give you an idea of how organizations are creating ownerships and governance. So in front of you, I made this simplified. I just call it service and service offerings. We don't really care if it's a technical or business service right now. But then here we have an application service with infrastructure. So let's split this up in two dimensions. One is the more service layer, and the second is the more operational layer. What we see when people define ownerships in CSDM is then that there tends to be an owner who can really speak on behalf of the entire technology stack in the application service. So how is it configured? How is it set up? What is the critical components and infrastructure? So a contact person. We also see here that there tends to be owner or owners for the service and offerings, but they are more maybe on the business and sort of the service side of things. But interestingly enough, here we are speaking about a vertical ownership. So either down here in the stack or up here in the service and service offering hierarchy. But we also then see that organizations tend to define horizontal ownerships. So here we can see examples of For example, you might have technical services and offerings for hosting. And these two servers here, they belong to hosting services Azure. And these here, they belong to hosting services Docker and maybe database services for Oracle. So this is an interesting mixture that I wanted to mention here, because a lot of organizations are actually struggling with how should we distribute the ownerships, and it might look different depending on the industry and use cases, but this can be a valuable blueprint to take inspiration from, and that we've seen that a lot of other clients are striving for, both in our research but also in our own projects.
Yeah.
Fabian, was there something you'd like to add there, or I think this is something that you've also encountered probably?
Yeah, it's a good baseline model, and I like it. I think it's important to understand that when we talk about ownership, one of the biggest topics that I tend to encounter with companies is that ownership is most of the time not clearly defined. So what really helps, in addition to this ownership blueprint, is making sure that if you have some kind of owner, like a technical service owner, that you have a one-pager of what are you expecting this technical service owner to do? What is the task? Like, what does it do on a day-to-day basis, so that they have an orientation for it? I think that can help massively.
Love that addition to it. Super important to be clear about what does it mean to own something, what comes with that responsibility. Super nice. Okay, but then Fabian, irrespective of the ownerships, then when we're gonna work with those service owners, you work with a lot of service owners.
Yes.
What are some of your tips for like really getting the stakeholders involved?
So when we talk about getting stakeholders involved, the key understanding is first identifying, of course, who those stakeholders are. And you will notice that a lot of these stakeholders tend to already have a full day, right? And we need to get them excited about the topic. And this is where the storytelling comes in. So for example, we have one customer that did a POC with CSDM, and through their mapping of the different services, they managed for a business unit to essentially allow them to reprioritize proactive tasks, because they were now able to give CIs a contextualization. They understood that this server is now more important than another server because they had the CSDM model in place. They understood that a certain application service is all of a sudden more important because it provides a service towards a critical business service offering. And that contextualization allowed them to get rid of any P1 incidents, because they could reprioritize proactive measurements into their day-to-day work. So they were able to say, hey, this proactive measurement, that's more important than our incident that we have right now. And we are now doing workshops with that customer, CSDM workshops with their service owners, and we're just running with that storyline. We're just getting service owners on board to CSDM because we are able to prove to them, hey, this was an internal success. So getting a impactful and measurable success story going helps you get these owners on board. Because if you just go in and show them the CSDM model, for them, it's just a blueprint. It's just a foundation. It's just a framework. And if you can get them on board with a story behind it, with, hey, this could be you, right? It could be your business unit that now no longer has P1 incidents. It could be your business unit that isn't getting called in the middle of the night because something breaks down. Then that gets people on board, that gets people going, because you cannot underestimate, or you shouldn't underestimate, that with introducing CSDM, the first step definition of objects will always come with work attached. And you have to give a reason why that work is worth it. And this is actually a second point, the keeping it straight part. If you look at CSDM, there is a reason why certain things are named that way. And you're not going to make it easier for yourself if you start renaming things. You're not going to make it easier if you rename relationship types. And this is true because at some point in your maturity journey, you are going to move to different parts of your company. And you will have sections of your company that name things different. And that's okay. But it's your CSDM model, right? Yeah. It's your definition of the world. So maybe have a glossar ready, have a translation level ready, right? Approaching teams and saying, hey, your application service is this and that. I've done workshops with automotive manufacturers, and I went out to the manufacturing plants and we had workshops, and it was just a thing of explaining, hey, your application service is literally this production line where at the end you have a metal pressed sheet. That's your application service. That's it. And getting that thought process in really helped out. And this also is true to, like, when you're trying to connect business services or technical service, really having that clear definition in mind is important. And then lastly, what helps with these workshops is an apply and conquer system, right? Not just showing the CSDM model and explaining it, but really take an hour of a workshop and go to a whiteboard, model the services of that team on a whiteboard, start off with one, and then apply that model in ServiceNow so they can see it. They can now open up an incident against it and show them how to do that in ServiceNow. You want to hand over that knowledge of maintaining that model, usually, because otherwise you are going to spend your whole day in modeling services for other teams. And this really is important to have that 3 steps in there, to start off with a great story, keep the CSDM definition straight and as structured as possible, and then applying that in the same workshop. So people go out of that workshop and are kind of ignited about that. Okay, we need to do CSDM, and hey, here we already modeled it. It was somewhat easy, so now we can do it as well in the next 5 hours. And that's really, really one of the points.
Yeah, I love it. And this is what I mentioned in the beginning when I said that for me, it's like an exercise of organizational psychology almost. So it ties very well into that.
Can I add one thing, Alex, if I may?
Of course.
We also ask, and this will be more in the report, upcoming report, but we also even ask for which stakeholders that the CSDM project aim to resolve pain points and improve their way of working. So for when you do storytelling, we know, we ask organizations that, for example, they're enterprise architects, end users, and IT operations engineers and help desk at CSDM solve certain their way of working and pain points. And we have asked, it will be in our report, and we have, majority, more than half of the correspondents said it solved their pain points and improved their way of working with this CSDM project. In addition to your story, Fabian, you can also use these kind of statistics to back up your story, why you should do a CSDM.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, Akif. So, guys, then with roughly 12 minutes left, Fabian, some food for thought here then. Again, tying into what you has mentioned, being tangible, being very crisp about CSDM. What does that mean? And I think here you've split it up in a couple of different areas, KPIs, governance, etc. Could you expand briefly on this?
Yeah, so generally speaking, what I encounter with a lot of companies that do CSDM is they reach a point where they are in air quotes done and try to find out what is the next steps. Do we now define business service or business service offerings? Usually 3 points get a bit overlooked. One is measuring the actual impact that your redefinition has just through process KPIs, like getting KPIs about mean time to resolve, reassignment counts, for example, for your ITSM processes, to really show and highlight and get to the point that you have success stories and just measure that success as well. And this will help you, again, going back to the storytelling, it helps you to just show, hey, what we are doing brings value, right? It helps you to improve your processes. It's actually something that we can measure here. So really defining KPIs sometimes in CSDM projects is really important. And that isn't just CMDB KPIs, it's process KPIs around the CMDB. The next topic that we touched on already is the governance topic, really making sure that once you've started with CSDM, you're not like letting go for a year and then you have to restart in a year again. So really keeping that data quality up to date, using the data manager within ServiceNow to shoot out emails or notifications of, hey, is this owner still the right owner for a business application, for example, really the maintaining part behind it. And then using the maturity that you gain through CSDM to really involve it into other processes to improve there as well. Philip has voiced a great question of, hey, usually one of the huge values we're missing is that CSDM really is a catalyst for different lenses and bringing different lenses together. And that's so true, because what we usually have is CSDM getting started on an operational level, and then it never leaves the operational side. It never gets to GRC. It never gets to ITBM, even though it could, because in ITBM, we can check if we have capabilities that we can reuse, or that we have business applications that we can reuse because they provide the capability that we need, right? In GRC, we know and understand how business applications work. So why don't we connect GRC with business applications and evaluate the business applications that we have? And this really is a step that's sometimes missing, that we understand that, yes, we might have started out with CSDM from an operational side, but now we can branch out into the other processes. We can use the added maturity, the added data quality, the added transparency on an operational and organizational level that we have to really improve outside of ITSM, ITOM, in BCM, in GRC. And this is a value that's kind of underestimated when we look at CSDM. Everyone is trying to just kind of have this side quest of getting all of the objects into the CMDB. It's kind of underestimated that, hey, we now define business capabilities and business applications. Let's utilize that. Let's involve that into the ITBM process. And those are really important key steps before you choose to branch out into another portion of CSDM. Think about, okay, how can I use what I have now to gain maturity in other processes?
Yeah, and it sounds obvious, but I think it's so true, because being really outcome based, like you mentioned, that it's too easy that CSDM falls into the trap of becoming a data model project down in the basement somewhere. But you really be more outcome based, like you said, of how can we leverage this in other pockets, in other processes. Very, very important indeed. Okay, so this was just some food for thought and some sort of best practices that we wanted to show around, especially like governance, ownerships. How do you work with service owners? What have we seen in the research? What have we seen in our own projects? We could speak for hours about all sorts of best practices and lessons learned. But to wrap it up then a little bit, then we also measured, Akif, the perception of CSDM. And here, I think it's interesting that, despite there of course comes with challenges of CSDM, either be it use cases or, concepts and definitions, people seem to be quite pleased with it. Could you expand a little bit here? What did we ask?
Despite having a strong opinion about CSDM, but the opinion, like let's say the strong opinion or the challenges are, we asked the correspondents, what would you do differently if you would start a CSDM project from scratch? And also we asked, would you recommend CSDM to others? Was the effort what was the effort worth at the end of the day? So what we have seen, what the responses were, the correspondents will still, the people will still recommend CSDM. It's 4.7 out of 5. And also, was it worth the effort? And it's 8 out of 10, which means the what does it mean? Because despite all these challenges, I guess people still see the value and benefits in CSDM in a high level, but maybe it might relate to other factors and not really the CSDM framework, because we asked what would be your, what would you recommend others? And so in the next slide, we have summarized the factors actually in these recommendations, and in our report you can find more extensive analysis around this. But what we have, what 60% of the correspondents said, it's the challenge lies more in concepts, CSDM concepts, and really understanding CSDM concepts, use cases, trying to prove the use case and value of CSDM, but also not making it tangible enough. And because of that, we see also like 40% of the correspondents said some investment and time factors, like proving the value to the management, or when drafting the scope of CSDM, it's a never-ending project. So these are we have in our report, we will do a more extensive analysis. I want to be mindful of the time. We have 6 minutes left. Let's have lots of questions. But again, despite all these challenges and factors impacting, we see at the end of the day, people will still recommend CSDM to others, and they think it's worth the effort to do.
Yeah, no, it's very
What do you think, Fabian and Alex, about it?
No, but I think it's quite accurate that ultimately what we see is that it brings values, and also looking at, and it's not just something we say as consultants or something like that, but really looking at, otherwise people wouldn't keep on expanding CSDM, otherwise they wouldn't reinvesting in all of these things. We would see roadmap stagnating, we would see the concept not taking off. So clearly there is a value in investing time and effort, but for people who might be a bit more curious about this and how you can avoid to repeat certain mistakes that others have done, then I would really urge you to actually go into our report, which we launched recently, and then also have a look out for the 2 upcoming reports where we will really break down some of these key lessons and sort of what are those mistakes maybe that people wish they would have done differently if they would restart the CSDM initiative. So with all of this being said, it's been, an explosion of information here today, of data, of benchmarks, and so forth. So I hope that those of you who have been here in our masterclass have found it useful. I'd like to spend the final here 4 or 5 minutes on some questions, but one of the questions here we see is, often it is confusing, what is the purpose of a technical service, is one question that we received. As previously said in the webinar, I won't embarrass myself with trying to give a 1-minute definition of it today. But in general, what we see is that it's not always a straight answer. We see that some companies, they define it as their backend services. Other companies, they define it as, well, this is our hosting platforms. Or manufacturing companies, they define it as what we buy from the vendors, like MSP service providers, etc. So it can really vary, and I think that's also one of the key lessons, that the definitions and concepts, and also what you spoke about, Fabian, to really nail down, and a glossary of what do the definitions mean, can be very valuable, right?
I think adding on that, what helped me in defining technical services is, a service should always be the definition of purpose or value that something brings to the company. So an application service is the definition of purpose or value that a stack or IT infrastructure brings to the company. So a technical service, in a very simplified version of this, is the purpose and value that a group of people bring to a company, right?
Yes.
This doesn't always apply, but it gives us a good rule of thumb on how we can describe a technical service.
Yes, absolutely. Also a very interesting question here from Roman, which is, CSDM 5 is expected to bring quite a few changes. Indeed it will, especially like to the labels and definitions. So the question is, would you suggest investing much time into the adoption of 4.0, or rather wait for the version 5? I would say absolutely invest time. Then as long as you're being mindful, because labels will always change, and things iterate, things will improve, etc. As long as you find labels and sort of definitions which the organization can agree upon, then I think it will be a quite small bridge to get them to learn maybe an updated label or something like that. It's more around, as long as it's conceptually agreed upon, then what we see is people don't really mind calling it application service or service instance, for example, like in the CSDM 5 model. So I would say that, absolutely invest in it.
So there was a great set of questions from Philip, and I don't know if I could answer them all, but it's just one point that I like to highlight is, it is true that one of the most important points, at least from my view, is try to branch out CSDM beyond the operations part, because that's where a lot of a lot of value lies outside of just the operations part. That's a really good point.
Yes, and also I saw that we answered another question to finalize it with, don't we find it extremely disappointing that we're not developing business services more? And I think that's a little bit, there is some truth to it. Are we treating things like a pure technology exercise and not a business value exercise? I think it's coming more and more. We see more people mapping things like their value chains in ServiceNow. We're seeing people mapping business capabilities, etc. I think it's more a matter of that it has been misused in the past, and now we're seeing a correction in the market to actually use the right object. So it's not necessarily that people are ignoring business services. It's more just that people are more disciplined on when to use it, in my opinion.
Just one more thing to add. In addition to that, one of the main recommendations from the correspondents when we asked was to get the business more involved, of course, and get the IT. I think.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Closer alignment to the business was a key factor actually in the lessons learned. So again, everyone, I just want to say that it really means a lot for us here that you keep on showing up to these sort of masterclasses, that you're engaging with our research and content. We wouldn't be able to do anything of this without you in the community. So if you want to like stay in the loop, then for sure keep an eye out for our reports. You can already download the first version now. I'm not going to pitch it more now, as I've already said it a couple of times, but do follow us on LinkedIn because we're very active there, and also our YouTube channel where this will be recorded and uploaded as well. So with all of this being said, I think we succeeded, Fabian and Akif, with delivering what we should in an hour. And again, I hope that everyone has a great day and that you keep on showing up to our events in the future. So thank you, everyone.